Hello, it's Tuesday, but this will go out on Thursday or something, I think. I'm getting ahead of myself. I wanted to talk about Doctor Who. I'm going to do a video about my favourite Doctor Who books. So make a cup of tea and I'll tell you all about them. Hang on. It's really hard to, where's my tea going? To narrow down favourite Doctor Who's. I read them all my life. And already I'm thinking about ones I've not included in this pile. Things like Terrance Dicks's Destiny of the Daleks, which was the first one I ever read in 1979. And it was the thing that got me hooked on them in the first place. But that's way somewhere back there. It's not a great book, truth be told. It's only kind of a very short, skimpy version of the story, but it was enough to hook me into that world. What follows will be a kind of whistle-stop tour of some of my favourite things, all out of order, different series, different authors, not everybody whose work I like, and not including some of my friends who should be there. I've kind of grabbed these from shelves this morning as I've gone along, and it's obviously not talking about anything I've written. I could do a video about my own favourites that I wrote, but I won't. Right, first of all, The Devil Goblins from Neptune by Keith Topping and Martin Day. May 1997. And it was when the BBC took back the rights to Doctor Who books from Virgin, who'd had the rights for a number of years. And the BBC had been involved in the making of the Paul McGann TV movie, and suddenly they were doing their own books, their own 80,000 word novels, 2 a month. Seems amazing now to think back to that time, but it was exciting. I bought this in Glasgow. We went out the first day that these books came out. I was excited to read Doctor Who books again. Having dipped out of reading the New Adventures, which seemed a bit of a cliquey gang in some ways. They still do, looking back. Of course, these early ones, lots of them were written by people who'd written Virgin New Adventures. But somehow the newness of the series being with the BBC brought them to life for me. And this is a kind of proper early 70s romp with kind of more adult overtones, perhaps. It was a good reintroduction back to the books. And it made me go back. This is dated June 97, although it was published in 94. Craig Hinton's The Crystal Bucephalus. Now, a Fifth Doctor novel that involves some kind of space restaurant at some point, and the Doctor nips out onto some kind of ice world and lives there for 5 years, training to be a chef and being trained by rabbits who own the restaurant. I think that's right. It's kind of slightly Douglas Adamsy, but it's Craig Hinton, so it's camper and even sillier and just extraordinary. I hate the word extraordinary because people use it about things that aren't extraordinary. And I really think that the books of Craig Hinton, who I never met, he died before I could meet him, although we had communicated by email and stuff, and he'd written for an anthology that I edited, and he just seemed such a lovely bloke. And his was one of the books I went back to gather up when I got my enthusiasm back in 97. I scoured the bookshops of Edinburgh and Glasgow for books published under the Virgin imprint that were still floating about in shops. I bought all the ones I could and gobbled them up. I was glad that I did, and it set me off. Here's one of the early Eighth Doctor books, Vampire Science, by Kate Orman and Jonathan Blum. And it was Doctor Who meets Buffy. It had to happen. Somebody had to do it. And they did. July 1997. I'm almost following myself through the months of reading Doctor Who that year. I love this. It's San Francisco, like the TV movie was. And it's gutsy and bloody and funny. And suddenly I was getting a sense of what could be done in the late 90s in Doctor Who books. And so very quickly I became determined to do my own. Right, flashing back into the early 80s when I was first obsessed. These Target books that everybody goes on about. Everybody who likes Doctor Who seems to have. Well, maybe that's not true anymore. Maybe they have more modern stuff. But for generations, the Target books, and now they've come back, of course. Malcolm Hulke wrote The Cave Monsters, based on the story The Silurians. Now, Hulke writes about 6 or 7 novelizations of his own stories in the early 70s, and he was, I think, the best. Everyone talks about Terrance Dicks, and he was marvelous, but Malcolm Hulke does something special with his own stories. He isn't afraid to change them or to tell them from unusual points of view. They're very novelly books, if that makes sense. He also wrote a series of 4 Crossroads novels, which I absolutely love. Maybe I'll talk about those at some point. He's not afraid to take those in funny directions as well. There's a whole section in one of the Crossroads novels that goes a bit Wicker Man, believe it or not, a bit Dennis Wheatley, a bit black magic-y, which you're not expecting in Crossroads. Anyway, these are written by somebody who can write soap. That's what it is. So what he's most interested in are the characters. Terrance Dicks, of course, did knock out some wonderful books, and this was an early one I read. Look at that cover. It's the kind of the ship and the particular Daleks and the particular look of the movie rather than the TV show, which is interesting. So it has a kind of slightly epic look to it. And slim as it is, the book does too. There's that wonderful chapter where our heroes are hiding in the house of a mother and daughter who sell them out to the Daleks. And of course, it's a complete, it's about the Gestapo, really, as the Daleks always are. Chilling. One of the few times I think that the Daleks feel chilling to me as monsters, because they rarely do. In any kind of Doctor Who to me, they were always not very chilling. Although of course it was the Dalek books that we read. My brother and I, first of all, when we got into Doctor Who books, we'd read Destiny of the Daleks. We raced to the shop in the 2 bookshops in Durham, where there were big displays in 1979 for Doctor Who books. We bought the Dalek books first. And this very first one was essential. And we had a copy as well called Doctor Who in an Exciting Adventure with the Daleks, published by Armada Books, and before Target came along. I kind of wish all Doctor Who books had that in the title, in Doctor Who in an Exciting Adventure with Crusaders. That would be fun. Anyway, this is again a very novelly novel from Ian's point of view, changing all the beginning, how they meet the Doctor and everything, writing over an unearthly child, which is interesting, with a more interesting start, I think. I think I prefer it. I certainly read this book before I saw An Unearthly Child on its repeat in 1981. Terrance Dicks' The Day of the Daleks is another kind of retelling of Dalek Invasion of Earth, but with time travel stuff that was later. I hesitate to say, but you can see it reflected in the storyline of Terminator. The idea of going back into the past as a political activist and causing the very things that you set out to change. A great kind of time travel story. Smashing. I'm going to whiz through some more targets quickly. Auton Invasion, another chunky Terrance Dicks one from the beginning. Everyone loves this one, and it's you can see why Russell took some of the elements from it to reboot Doctor Who with Rose. You know, the Taylor Dummies, the hospital, the Doctor being in his pajamas and dashing about. These things were useful ways to reintroduce the Doctor to living on Earth, I think. Right, Green Death, Malcolm Hulke, and the Sea Devils, Malcolm Hulke. These covers are from the later or the early 80s and are very nostalgic in their own way. I said it recently, I forget where, but every one of the Malcolm Hulke stories feel like a pilot movie for a series that should shoot off somewhere. He creates what they would now call franchises. There should be a series about creatures under the earth who've been there for millions of years waiting to come out, and how they interact with Earth's governments. That seems so loaded in terms of not just the kind of ecological arguments, but also politics, how we share the planet. That should be, it should be there. And his stuff about pollution and computers in the Green Death, everything he wrote about was kind of prescient and loaded with possibilities. Now, some unusual ones. Hang on, I'll do these first. More Targets. Visitation by Eric Saywood. He gets a bad press from fans for his books and his TV shows and his involvement in the series, because there was lots of acrimonious stuff about editing the series in the years he did, and people were quite awful about his eventual novelizations of his Dalek stories. I never read them; they sounded awful, but I liked his earlier books. I remember The Visitation coming out in '82. I think it was one of the first tie-ins to the Peter Davison years, and it went alongside things like the Book of Alien Creatures and Planets, and it was terrific. It felt again like a kind of slightly grown-up novel, not least because it had a um, photographic cover, so it felt more like the Emmerdale Farm novelizations, of which my mum had a whole shelf in our front room, and that seemed. I was 12, so reading things that looked a bit more grown up seemed important briefly. What else? More Targets. This is my favourite of all. The Demons by Barry Letts is the absolute best target. He takes the best TV show and makes something fabulous out of it. It's such a warm retelling. You can tell that everybody involved in making this as a TV show felt warmly towards the material, towards the time they had making it. And, it's a kind of, again, Dennis Wheatley type black magic story about being stuck in a village where the master turns out to be the evil vicar. There's a lovely white witch on hand to help. The devil himself seems to be summoned up on live TV. Everything about it is brilliant. And the first chapter proper begins: Doctor Who was a happy man. The birds were singing a spring song, the sun was gleaming on Bessie's new coat of daffodil paint, and there was a pleasant tang of engine oil in the air. Doctor, you haven't been listening. The doctor looked up from his open bonnet, the open bonnet of his beloved old car. Oh, yes, I have, he said, smiling at the indignation in Joe Grant's face. You were talking about this new pop group who wear vine leaves in their hair. That was ages ago. I mean, simply centuries. I've been going on about that TV program. What do you think will happen? And of course, it turns out it's a live broadcast of the opening of a barrow in a field, a hill that's meant to contain the grave of the tomb of a chieftain from the Iron Age, or whatever, Bronze Age, Iron Age. And of course, the doctor realizes it's something he has to go and investigate that very night, leaving the unit fellows watching the rugby and eating corned beef sandwiches and drinking tea while he races through the night against time, with Joe in the car beside him and the devil about to arrive in Devil's End. Fantastic, fantastic book. There was a kind of loose, not sequel, but retake, redo, reimagining, to use that overused word, that Barry Letts did with Terrance Dicks for one of the anniversaries in the early 2000s, I think. It wasn't very good, unfortunately. I wish there'd be a proper sequel to The Demons. When at some point, when Jodie Whittaker was the Doctor, there was talk of doing a series of books that were cover versions, in which the Doctor and her current companions would, because of the Time War, because of whatever reason we could come up with, they would redo a story. And how would that change in the present day? And I was longing to do The Demons. The Demons would be set in here, it would be set in South Manchester, in a church in the inner city, where the city had encroached and built over the graveyard, where the church stood on a high street, and the church was now, I don't know, a community centre or a greengrocer's or something. And you'd still run the story of Miss Hawthorne and Missy, it would be, being the local vicar, um, summoning up the devil on Levenshulme High Street. But it never happened. We never got to do this series of cover versions. I'd still love to do it. I still think mine would be fantastic. Here's another one. Now we're back into the 90s with Andrew Hunt writing one of the new adventures when everything seems so fresh and new, and he brought some fantasy into it. In the Cat's Cradle series, this was Witchmark. This was a trilogy, the second set of books that came out with Virgin Books. And we'd had a kind of steampunk or cyberpunk book. We'd had historical fantasy. We'd had space opera. We'd had a kind of weird psychological, almost like Robert Silverberg or somebody, that kind of book from Paul Cornell. And now we had something that meshed Celtic fantasy with dark fantasy and science fiction, a bit like the kind of Charles de Lint kind of novels, those kind of things. And I loved this. This was my favorite new adventure of all of them. Right, now, some unusual ones to finish off with. My friend Nick Campbell, who's a bookseller, years before James Goss wrote his version of Scratchman under Tom Baker's name for BBC Books in recent years. Nick, with access only to a synopsis published in Doctor Who magazine, wrote his own version of Scratchman as he imagined it. I shouldn't even go on about it. He's probably embarrassed that I am, maybe not. I adore this. He did a tiny edition of about 5 and gave them to friends. This is years ago now, when I first knew him. And I absolutely love this. It kind of mixes in the Wizard of Oz sequels by Frank Baum. It mixes in Margaret Rutherford. It's a proper tea time story. And I love it. Right, now, these are books that I was involved in. These are charity books that are no longer available. They were done in tribute to two people in particular. No, they weren't tribute. They were to raise funds for them. Tommy Dombavand was a wonderful kids writer who wrote the Scream Street series of books for kids. And when he was very ill, this is about 6 years ago, when he was very, very ill, he couldn't go out and do school visits, which was how he made most of his income, doing visits and readings, and he wasn't writing like he did. So we produced, with Obverse Books, a charity anthology. A Target for Tommy was the first one, getting all sorts of wonderful people to contribute stories. I wrote to everybody I knew and asked them. Some of them not Doctor Who people. Some of them weren't people who'd written for Doctor Who ever before. And it was interesting how they took to it and the kind of things that we got. We also had some old timers from Doctor Who books, and that was great as well. We did a second Target for Tommy. These are huge books because the print's quite small. But the idea was to do them as complete Target-sized entities, and I think they're magic because that's what we never got with Target books until recent years. They did one volume, didn't they, of Target short stories. Why wasn't there back in the day Target collections of stories, original stories? Now, the second one was interesting because I'd written to everyone I could think of and pushed and cried and shouted and begged. And Stephen Moffat didn't have to be, didn't have to beg him, didn't have to push or anything. He was so generous and sweet. And he sent us a chunk of the original script, first draft script of The Day of the Doctor, the 50th anniversary special, which was significant. And I remember getting this as a Word file on my phone. We'd arrived in Whitby for a weekend. And he sent this piece, and it was, I can't find it in the book now. It was scenes that involved Christopher Eccleston's Doctor in scenes that eventually were rewritten for John Hurt's War Doctor, which confirmed for the first time that he'd written it for Eccleston in the first place, which was fascinating and bizarre and wonderful. And it meant that this anthology, this charity book, sold a lot more copies because it became a lot more essential to fans to collect. So we did well. We did well with that, and it was a good thing to do. Also, Anthony, our lovely friend, another friend, who died in recent years, and we were writing a book, putting together another very similar anthology as a kind of latter-day Target book. And there were stories, these are funnier and sillier and camper stories, written by people who mostly knew Anthony, who was a massive, massive Doctor Who fan, just the same as Tommy was. And we got some hilarious things from people, and lots of pictures and photos and all sorts of stuff in this one. And Anthony himself, who, we hoped would live long enough to see the finished book, rallied slightly and suddenly said, "Darlings, I'm going to write my own final chapter. Ha ha!" And he did. And he wrote a story for his own valedictory anthology. There's a word for it in German. It's called a Festschrift, I think, a book celebrating the life of one person, composed of essays and stories about them by people who knew them. And I think Festschrift is exactly what we did for those two lovely fellas. And we did them because some kind of Target book was the best thing we could think of doing as a tribute. Anyway, I don't want to be maudlin, but it's nice to have these quite rare collections. There's other rare Doctor Who books around, other charity books, other one-offs that came out and disappeared, and I like to have collected them up alongside the books that we all have, the Targets and the Virgin books and the BBC books and the Telos novellas. Oh, yes, Telos novellas. Now, these were nice in the early 2000s. This is Kim Newman's Time and Relative, a story that predates the first Doctor Who story on TV. It's snowy and creepy and very 1960s. And I love the fact that it exists. Similar setting, actually, is Imaginary Friends by Jack Rayner. Bang up to date. This is the end of last year, set just before the beginning of the TV show, from the point of view of a little kid who gets drawn into the adventures of the Doctor and his friends. It's a very spooky and lovely and very kind of nostalgic book. Nostalgia for a time you didn't even live in is a very interesting thing. In some ways, it's central to reading, isn't it? That books can convince us that we belong to other times. That's a good note to finish on. I've gone over. This is my Doctor Who book video. I might do another. I've barely scratched the surface of Doctor Who books and what I think about them. But I will stop here, and I'll remind you to click like if you would, and subscribe to my channel, and to leave comments. I adore the comments. I'm sure Doctor Who as an idea, as Doctor Who as a topic, will attract comments. I hope so. Everybody's got an opinion about these things. Okay, I'm going to say goodbye, and I'll see you soon in the next episode. Bye bye.